So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Lana Zimmerman. I'm an associate project manager here at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. And on behalf of my team at UCLA and the American Forest team, we want to welcome you and thank you for joining us this afternoon. And I'd like to start by thanking Amaya, who's our operations coordinator at UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, who helped coordinate this event. For everyone's information, this webinar will be recorded. And the reason that we're here today is the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation HEAT team and American Forest is hosting this webinar to share the shade layer that we have added to Tree Equity Score for over 360 cities and the Tree Equity Score Analyzer for Detroit, Austin, and Maricopa County. Additionally, we'll be sharing the data stories that Julia at American Forest designed to visualize some possible uses of the data that we'll be sharing. The question and answer feature is available via the chat box, not the actual chat, but the question and answer chat at the bottom of your screen. And then we will have the availability to have a live question and answer segment at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick agenda to give you an introduction to what we'll be discussing today. We're going to start with remarks from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who funded this effort. Then Dr. Kelly Turner from the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation will give us an introduction to the importance of shade and the reason behind why we developed these products. And then Julia Twitchell from American Forest will walk through a tutorial for Tree Equity Score and Tree Equity Score Analyzer, specifically focusing on the shade layer or the shade map that we've added. She'll also give a brief introduction to the data stories that she designed. And then I will follow up with sample findings from the Tree Equity Score Shade Map. And this is the national map with shade data for over 330 cities. And then we'll move into a Q&A portion. So with that, I'll pass it over to George Hober from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation.
Hello, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm George Hober. I'm a senior program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I was one of the program officers that designed this call for proposals. And for those of you who are not aware, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is the nation's largest philanthropy with a specific focus on health. And in our past, we have done a lot with data. We've worked with our grantees and partners to demonstrate the impact of using data as a communications tool in particular, and in doing so, increase the understanding of how the conditions of place influence health and health equity. We have a lot of well-known examples of using data in this way. One in particular is our life expectancy maps, which I think a lot of people have shown that have shown how life expectancy differs just across zip codes or even neighborhoods. In addition, we started to explore showing how the impact of redlining has long-term health impacts on communities. And it was out of that history of projects of using data and data visualizations to communicate a point that we developed this CFP to communicate the impact of structural racism on communities. And so the data visualizations that result from this work, we were hoping they would do exactly that, illuminate a very complex issue like structural racism, and we wanted them to be in powerful communications tools to advance policy change efforts and programming by persuading audiences, whoever they are, policymakers, media, community advocates, of the legacy and current consequences of racism. So this project was one of 8 selected in a competitive call for proposals to visualize that connection between structural racism, place, and health. And like I said earlier, we've always relied on communications and data as a way to get important points across. So that was the point of this call for proposals. And you'll get a detailed introduction to this project, but the completed projects out of that funding opportunity can all be found on our website, and the link is provided here on the slide. So with that, I want to thank UCLA and American Forest for being good partners on this project, excellent grantees, and I will give it over to them to lead the rest of the webinar.
Thank you so much, George, and thank you so much to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for supporting this work, and for seeing that shade is central to equity in the United States. I'm going to start. My name is Kelly Turner. I'm a faculty in urban planning and geography at UCLA. I'm also the associate director of the Luskin Center for Innovation, where I lead our heat research group. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about why shade is so important. Simply put, shade is the most effective tool we have to cool people when they're outside. All else equal, people can feel around 30 degrees Celsius cooler in the shade immediately than someone who's standing just a few feet away. And that's using a metric called mean radiant temperature, which is an indicator that is a composite of all the various sources of heat that might be making our bodies feel warm. Shade is so effective because it prevents the sunlight from hitting your body in the first place. And sun is the main reason we feel hot. This is something that we already know intuitively. If you can think about a time that you were outside and it was really hot, you probably found a tree that was shady to stand under or an overhang. But shade does double duty. It protects our bodies from the sunlight, but it also protects the surfaces around us. So it's preventing warming of our environment as well. Next slide. Shade is so effective, it can actually make the difference between whether it's safe or not to do the things you want to do in your daily life outside. And as the climate warms, that's going to become more and more important, because it's one thing to say it's really hot outside, you should stay inside, drink water, but those are really blunt tools to solve the problem. As some communities are going to see days, maybe half of the days of the year are in what would be traditionally thought of as unsafe temperature conditions, it's really important to find ways to keep people outside and doing the things they need to do. So one of the things that shade can do is it can lower the metabolic rate that your body needs to conduct a certain activity. So that might mean on a 95-degree day with 20% humidity, you might be unsafe to go running in full sun. Maybe all you could do is stand. But if you have shade, you could still do that activity. Now, that's something that's important to us maybe in our daily lives, but it's also critical for things like labor and making sure children are safe at school. Next slide. Another great thing about shade is that it can be cast by any vertical object in the environment. Anything that's blocking the sun is creating shade. And so we refer to that as shade infrastructure. All of the green and built features that are blocking the sun, but we also included all the associated systems that are there to implement shade. So why do I mention that? Well, a lot of us think about trees as being good shade providers. However, we don't necessarily think about the combination of all the features in the environment that might be producing shade in our communities. And next slide. A failure to really think through where shade is and plan for it and embed it into our policies and our zoning codes can lead to shade deserts. These are places in the city that don't have enough shade to keep people safe when it's hot outside. And here I give an example of a very common shade desert that we see in our communities. Our research is showing that schools, by and large, have less shade than the communities that they're located in. Why? Because systematically they've been designed to exclude trees, canopies, and other tall vertical objects that might cast shadow. Next slide. So the first step is awareness, and that's a big reason why we are here today to build this map. And we hope that armed with data, cities can understand if they have enough shade and which communities have access to it, and then start planning for more. And I'm showing the example here of one of our partner cities, Phoenix, which has done exactly that. Next slide. Okay, so a little bit under the hood, what did we do? We used high resolution 1 meter data from LiDAR, along with building footprints during the summer solstice. And we use that to model shade using something called Solway, which is one of the various simulation environments in which you can do this. We looked at 3 different snapshots of the day, noon, 3 p.m., and 6 p.m., and that way we could capture minimum shade at noon when sun is directly overhead and maximum shade at 6 p.m. when it's a little lower in the horizon. We also importantly mapped tree versus building shades so that cities who are using this tool can see what's made from fixed structures and what's coming from trees and other things that can cast shadow in the environment. And then finally, we have outputs that show the presence and absence of shade and the percent shade cover in given areas. Next slide.
All right, hi everyone. So my name is Julia Twitchell. I work at American Forest on our data science team and had the pleasure of joining forces with the Luskin Center for Innovation to make this shade data available to you guys through our Tree Equity Score platform. So first, just a little bit about American Forests. We are a national nonprofit. We have sort of 2 major programmatic focuses. One focus is our sort of large landscape scale reforestation and restoration work, and our other focus is urban forestry and tree equity. And if you're not familiar with the idea of tree equity, this is the idea that, this comes from the observation that in city after city across the United States, low-income communities and communities of color have less tree cover. They therefore receive fewer of the benefits that trees provide, like air pollution and uptake, public health benefits, mental health benefits, and of course, why we're here today, shading and cooling. We created Tree Equity Score here at American Forest. It's the national tool, covers all urban areas in the US. That's about 80% of the population that lives in those areas and can find their Tree Equity Score, and about 12,000 US cities and towns. And this is really designed to be a standardized measure from 0 to 100, where we look at tree canopy need combined with climate health and community priority. And it's really all about guiding investment in neighborhoods with the greatest need. So you can find this at treeequityscore.org. And so we can go to the next slide. Awesome. So we're really excited to make shade data available through Tree Equity Score because it gives you another data-driven layer of information. Shade coverage ties very closely to the issue of tree equity. Communities that have less tree coverage also have less shade, and they're also going to be disproportionately affected by heat and other environmental stressors that trees mitigate. So until now, we really lacked a clear citywide view of shade distribution in different cities in the United States. So for the first time, we're really visualizing neighborhood level shade cover for most of the major cities in the US, and being able to look at your city and identify neighborhoods that have a lot of shade and those that don't. And that's going to help to invest in shade solutions in areas of the greatest need and to sort of more equitably tackle issues around extreme heat and climate justice. So we can go to the next slide. I'm about to demo this, but I want to cover both of our tools first. We also have deep dive tools for Tree Equity Score at American Forests. And so for Austin, Detroit, and Maricopa County, Arizona, which is the county that Phoenix, Arizona resides in, we chose these areas to represent sort of a cross-section of different climates and cityscapes in America. For these 3 places, we have even more detailed and granular shade cover available down to the property level. So we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. But property level data is going to help a city sort of refine its shade planning even further by helping you understand how shade cover varies within each neighborhood. And what we've really found with this project is just how patchy shade can be and how micro you can really get when you're talking about shade planning. So Amaya, I'm going to take over the screen share to do a little bit of a demo here. All right. That's good. Okay, so when you first navigate to Tree Equity Score, this is treeequityscore.org. You have 2 different choices. Like I said, you have our national map where we have all of the major cities represented with shade cover at the neighborhood level, and you have the local analyzers for Austin, Detroit, and Maricopa County. So for those of you here from those areas, that's where you're going to look for more detailed shade. We're going to start with our national map. Okay, and when you get into the map, it's really quite simple. You can see all of the urban areas covered in green. That's where 80% of the population lives, which is kind of amazing. And you're just going to zoom in until you get down to the neighborhood level. And that's where you're going to start to see your tree equity scores and a little information coming up about canopy cover and other factors in the sidebar. So the shade data is now available in our layers list. We have the 3 timestamps for noon, 3 p.m., and 6 p.m. And what you're seeing is the sort of oranges are the areas with the least shade. And as the grays become darker, you have more shade. I'm just going to show you noon. And then 3 p.m. it's getting a little shadier. And then by 6 p.m. when those shadows are getting longest, you've got quite a bit more shade throughout the county. And as you click around the map, you can get an estimate of total shade for each neighborhood at that timestamp. And you can also get the breakdown of how much shade is being contributed from buildings and how much is being contributed by trees. And you'll see as you get later in the day, that contribution of buildings is going to go up, and we'll talk about that a little bit more going forward. One of the great things about this is you can start to look at patterns citywide. So for example, we can see, there's more shade kind of in this northeastern area and less shade coming around down here. So if we're looking at tree canopy cover, for example, you can see a little bit more of that cover again in that northeast corner. If we look at people in poverty, you can see higher poverty rates down along sort of that southeast stripe where that shade is a little bit lower. And same with people of color. So you can start to look at these patterns citywide and start that conversation around shade equity and what's happening across your community. Another great tool in this is our prioritization, our filters list. So you can now filter by shade. I'm going to select 3 p.m. and we'll drag this down until maybe 25% shade cover. So you can start to narrow down to fewer block groups. And then you can layer other indicators as well. So if you want to, for example, and target any areas that are majority or above 50% poverty rates, you can really start to narrow down to those areas of the city for your prioritization work and thinking about where shade solutions can have the most impact. I'm going to reset that. If you are looking for your city and you just want to see, do I have data? You can type it in, or you can scroll around the map. And you'll see that, like I said, most major cities will be covered by the shade map at this point, which is a very exciting new addition. To Chicago here as well, so you can see that. So, click around the map and look for your city. There are a few cases where, lighter coverage wasn't fully complete, so we did our best to cover, but there's a lot in here and it's really exciting. So I'm going to head over now to our analyzer tool. We're going to take a peek at the same spot, Maricopa County, but a little bit of a deeper dive. So this tool for our Austin, Detroit, and Maricopa County participants here today really takes the same data out of the National Explorer. The same shade data will be available at those different timestamps for neighborhoods. The same filters also available, so you don't have to use the National Explorer. But then what you can do is zoom in further, and it will break down into parcels. And now in your layers list, when you click on shade, you'll get those 3 timestamps, but they are now summarized for all the different properties, as well as intersections and road segments. And of course, we do the breakdown of building shade versus tree and other shade. And if you're very curious, you can zoom in. These are the actual tree outlines You can see the buildings on the map. You can also switch over to satellite imagery if that's something of interest to you while you're thinking about shading solutions. And this map as well has filters at the parcel level. So you can, should zoom out a little bit, but you can look for areas that have sort of really limited shade and narrow down this way if that's helpful to you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and Maya, if you can pull the slides back up, we'll go over to the data stories. Amazing. So we'll go to the next slide after this. Perfect. So we were really excited as a part of this project to get the chance to do some sort of more localized research using the shade data to look at sort of local insights for those 3 focus cities. So we're going to share the stories in the chat as we go, and I'll let you guys explore on your own, but just wanted to pull some of the main findings that we found because it was a very cool project. So in Austin, Texas, we mapped shade for every sidewalk in the city. We created a map tool for students to be able to locate their school and then map their walking route to find the shadiest sidewalks on the way to school. And so overall, the findings, looking at all the sidewalks across Austin, we found that sidewalk shade is patchy, and I think that probably resonates for anyone who's used to walking around a city on a hot day. Some sidewalks are going to be a little bit shaded and some are going to be in the full sun. So on average, we saw about 30 to 60% shade over Austin sidewalks, which means you're in the sun at least half of the time. We also found that trees are really the MVPs for commuters, right? So over 95% of sidewalk shade is coming from trees during school hours and keeping kids cool. We also saw that coverage isn't equal. So some neighborhoods and school districts in Austin have more more shade than others. So next story, please. And I think we got that story shared in the chat for folks who are interested. In Detroit, we mapped shade cover for every bus stop in the city. The map tool in the story allows you to zoom in on your bus route and then find your actual bus stop and see how much shade there is for the different times of day. What we found when we looked across all the bus stops in Detroit is that about 90% of Detroit's bus stops have poor shade, which means about 0 to 25% shade, even at 6 p.m. when the sun is lowest and the shadows are longest. They're going to have much less at midday. So that's leaving about 85,000 daily transit riders in Detroit exposed to extreme heat. We also looked at bus shelters. In Detroit specifically, we found they really aren't great sources of shade. They do other great things like protect you from rain and wind and snow, but they don't really provide significant shade. And vegetation and built features, buildings specifically, are going to provide more shade to bus stops than shelters at the moment. And trees provide most of that shade, especially when the sun is highest. We'll go on to the last slide here for me. Our last location we looked at was Phoenix, Arizona. Of course, many of you from Phoenix will know Phoenix is kind of ground zero for extreme heat. 2024 saw about 113 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and heat-related deaths in the county have surged 900% since 2014. So it is a very real situation in Phoenix. And like Kelly alluded to earlier, Phoenix is also leading the way in terms of shade planning. So last year, they made it an update to their shade master plan called Shade Phoenix, investing $60 million over the next 5 years to make outdoor spaces safer and more accessible during extreme heat. So in Phoenix, we focused on sort of one of their priority areas, which is looking at shade cover in parks. Based on the 2021 LIDAR shade, 89% of parks had shade levels below sort of their optimal recommendation of 30% cover. and about 20% were still below the minimum level, which is about 10% cover. And this Shade Phoenix plan is great because I think a lot of cities will be looking at it as an example. They include some recommendations for shade levels for different kinds of spaces. So when we looked closer at a few parks, we also, using the shade data, we also found that shade within parks can be inconsistent. And following their recommendations in this plan, certain areas like play structures or high use zones like pools or play zones or picnic areas, they're calling for 100% to 75% shade over those specific areas to make those actually safe for children and families to be outside in. And so when you look using shade data at this level, it can really help identify those priority areas to help you target shade interventions that are going to have the most impact on folks' ability to use their outdoor resources. And also it can help sort of to zoom in a little bit more, even if a park does meet that overall open space recommendation for 30%. Certain high use areas might not. So it can really be helpful, and the city has been integrating that data into their planning moving forward. So I'm going to toss it over to Lana to take the next slide.
Thank you, Julia. So as was mentioned, for tree equity score, we have shade data for over 330 cities at the census block group level. So now I wanted to take some time to show all of you the kinds of insights you can draw from the tool and to just hopefully spark your creativity for how you might use this going forward. So to start, we found that 91% of the United States cities in this tool have less than 50% shade at noon. And more than half of the cities in the tool have under 25% shade. This means that most places in US cities leave people fully exposed to sunlight with less usable space that is safe for everyday life when temperatures rise. And in the conversation about how much shade is enough shade, we've heard a few different targets mentioned in this webinar. And percent shade cover targets can be a useful place to start, but shade needs and benefits are very local and contextual, as we've seen through the data story findings. So they really depend on the area that you're shading, how it's being used, the time of day it's being used, and other nuanced contextual factors. Next slide, please. So some more sample findings point to the distribution of building shade versus tree shade. Trees provide 99% of shade when the sun is directly overhead, which is at noon. But as the day goes on, buildings contribute more shade. Most cities experience a large increase in shade from minimum cover at noon to maximum cover at 6 p.m. The shade cast throughout the day depends on each city's mix of trees and buildings. And trees provide fairly consistent shade throughout the day, so cities with high tree shade tend to have more consistent shade cover throughout the day. Meanwhile, shade from buildings changes significantly throughout the day. As a result, cities with high building shade often have a bigger gap in shade from midday to evening when the shadows get longer. Next slide, please. And something that we noticed was many cities have large shade gaps between neighborhoods. So we define a shade gap as the difference in shade cover between the shadiest and least shady neighborhoods within a city. So when some neighborhoods have lots of shade and others have little shade, shade becomes an equity and access issue. Shadier cities might have shade deserts, where less shade means less time in the day when it's safe to be outside. And even cities with little overall shade may have shade oases, where more shade enables people to spend more times outdoors. Shade gaps can further exacerbate other inequities, which include environmental racism. So with that concludes the substantive part of our webinar. I'll share a link to those findings in the chat so you can navigate to our landing page at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. And then on the side, there's a area that says research highlights, and you can click there. And our graphics, we're very grateful to Lauren Dunlap for helping visualize those high-level statistics. Here's our contact information. If any of you would like to follow up with questions about the data or use of the data going forward. But for now, we can start answering some questions for the Q&A. So we can start with the ones that are typed in the Q&A chat box. So I'll pass it to Kelly to answer some of those. And then I believe on this webinar, we have the capability to have you raise your hand and unmute. Amaya, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that assumption. And we can also facilitate questions that way.
Great, thank you. Should I start reading? And
Yeah, why don't we pick a few from the chat, and then it looks like we have a raised hand, so we can move on that way.
okay, great. Well, let's start. The first one is somebody who's writing that they are a Phoenix resident, and they're asking about tree plantings and some of the challenges of getting those to actually come to fruition and to maintain the trees and such. And they want to know how can the data presented today be used not only to advocate for added shade, but ensure that new trees and existing trees can be properly maintained to reach the potential they are sold for. So yeah, this is a huge problem. This data set is one. I'm going to answer another question that happens later on. They asked what time of the year. This is a single snapshot. It's from the summer solstice. We do not have plans right now to update this over time, but yes, tree survival rates are a huge issue. I think the same way that you would use the data to advocate for more shade, you could advocate for protecting shade in certain areas, especially if you know that tree losses are occurring there. Maybe we could toggle back and forth and go to the raised hand.
They might need to raise their hand one more time, and then we can unmute them.
Okay. In the meantime, I can answer some more questions.
Oh, we
okay.
actually have one here. I'm seeing it now. Elisabetta, I think. I can go ahead and if you can unmute.
Hello, I am Elisabetta. Looks like you can't see me. And it's a horrible echo. So maybe you just read my question instead.
Okay, that's fine. If you want to type the question, that works for us. We can move on to the next. It just says Zoom user. So if you want to ask your question.
Hi, I'm Jason Johns. I'm a board certified master arborist with over 26 years of experience in community forestry and urban forestry. My question is largely around stand composition and structure as it relates to shade. I'd never considered buildings as a function of shade before, but study is kind of illuminating. But I was wondering if you could comment further on stand composition. The three study areas, Detroit, Phoenix, and Austin, all vary wildly in terms of urban forest composition. I guess I'm trying to ask a technical question about how these stand compositions and structures came into play.
Yeah, we don't differentiate in this particular study about different species. This is not a tool for doing that. However, all shade is better than no shade, and there is some variation in the quality of the shade provided by different objects. Buildings actually do provide some of the best shade because they are opaque, but in trees, it depends on the species. Buildings don't provide the range of ecosystem services that trees would, right? So there's a trade-off there. And then shade sails are great because they're easy kind of urban acupuncture, but they're porous. I hope that
Fair
answers.
enough. Oh yeah, I was just thinking of like triple canopy. We're trying to think of ways to introduce more trees and stand complexity. So I was trying to get that, but wrong study. Sorry about that.
And I see Elisaveta has her question in here. It says shade has different depths and shadows do not have well distinguished boundaries. How do you handle these two circumstances? Yeah, that's a great question. This is anywhere there is shade. Again, it's as we commented to the previous user, we don't analyze the quality of the shade. However, in terms of cooling people, there's not a huge difference in the total reduction in the comfort of the individual.
I guess another relevant question, Kelly, is people are wondering if there's any other cities we're looking to expand this data to and who they can get in touch with if they have questions about that.
Well, our wonderful funders have provided a certain amount of funding and that has come to a close. But if you're interested in maybe using this kind of data in your city, reach out to anyone on this call. I could take your questions, Lana, Julia. We'd be happy to discuss ways to apply this to your city. I see a lot of technical questions. A lot of technical questions about the nature of the trees and how we dealt with that. Again, this is about the shadow. We didn't consider different types of trees. And then I can also link to Isaac, our data scientist, has a publication that describes the methods that we used. It's for a different study, but we used the same methods. So I'm going to link that in the chat for those who have really highly technical questions.
There's a question here that says, will the underlying data sets be open and available for download?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. At treeequityscore.org, we have a data downloads page. So the block group level national data will now include shade. And you can download that either as a US-wide data set or for your specific state. Not every single state has a major city with shade in it. So what I would do is just go to the tool, look for your city, make sure it's there, and then you can download your state if you want to grab the data. And it will give you the data for your columns for building, tree, and total shade at each of the 3 timestamps now. I also see another question I think is directed to me that says from Stephen Addison, how do I determine how many census blocks are below a canopy level without any other indicators? So that would be a great case where you can go into the National Explorer and open the filters menu. And there is specifically a tree canopy filter that will allow you to filter by % canopy alone. And then if you want to add other filters to that, you can. But you can isolate it in that way.
I see a couple questions on what seasons of the year we're basing the shade data on, and if we took into account other natural or built structures that make shade. And then someone was also wondering why we chose the summer solstice.
Yeah, okay. So we chose the summer because that's the hot this was ultimately driven by heat and protecting people from heat, and that is one of the hottest times of the year, and that's also when the sun is at its peak. So these are sort of peak conditions. And then the second part of the question, apologies.
What dates or seasons of the year are you basing the shade data on? So the summer solstice. And then did we take into account other natural or built structures that make shade?
Yes, included along with the tree data is also some information about canopy and other structures that are casting shadow, separate from the buildings. I also see a number of questions about change. I'm really excited that people are interested in evaluating change over time. That's not something that this project is going to do, but something we'd be excited to do in the future should that opportunity become available. And that would make a great data story too. I see that somebody's writing about a tornado and somebody else is writing about the wildfires. I also saw a question in here about how can this be used for public health communication? What I'd like to say about that is using our data stories is a great example of that. We have, I could highlight, for instance, the Austin one, which is showing different routes that children could take to school, but that could, it doesn't necessarily have to be focused just on children. Looking at sidewalks, you could help communicate, well, if it's a heat wave, here's one route you should take versus another. It can make the difference between, is it okay to be outside or not walking? Is there any data on the most used types of shade? Is there a distinction by the type of tree? By most used type of shade, if you mean used in actually implementing the infrastructure, that we could take a look at. It depends on the city. Most cities get most of their shade in the middle of the day from trees, even if they don't have much of it. And then later on, they get most of their shade from buildings, even if they don't have very much of it. And then, but that's not ubiquitously true. There's some variation between cities. If you mean the most used shade, like what people like, that is a fantastic question. It's something that we're exploring with mobility data. And I don't know, maybe in a year from now, we'll be having another webinar where we can show you what kind of shade people are using.
I think some of the next questions have to do with tree equity score, so I can jump in. One from Olivia Box. First question was, how are water bodies included in this work? In terms of shade, I can answer to that, which is that the LiDAR uses sort of a ground model and then anything above ground. So anything above ground is what's casting shade. And so the water bodies would be excluded. In tree equity score, we do also specifically exclude water bodies from the land area, which then goes into our calculations of canopy cover. Second question was, did the study take into account what the goals of the neighborhood might be? It's a really interesting point, actually. Oops, I just lost, clicked away. Where'd it go? Oh, it disappeared. Maybe someone answered it. But we do have tree canopy goals and tree equity score, but they are sort of considered minimum standard goals. So a neighborhood really has to do with sort of the minimum benefits of tree canopy that a neighborhood that a neighborhood should have based on sort of the density of the built environment and the biome it's in, whether like forested or a desert biome. And so I think your question is more about sort of the goals of, whether a neighborhood should be more parkland, open space, or residential. And that's really, I think, sort of a great question, but also separate from what the data is sort of is putting into. So we're really just focusing on a guideline for a minimum standard. And then from there, using sort of your local knowledge of an area, you can make that judgment call if you want to take it above or beyond. There was, oh yeah, the second question from Mark Kuder Our third question, looks like you capture the unhoused as a vulnerable group. What data did you use to capture people in poverty? So we actually don't capture the unhoused as a vulnerable group in tree equity score. We use data from American Community Survey to calculate poverty rates, and that's the percent of people living below 2 times the federal poverty level. So it's a specific indicator within the American Community Survey. Hopefully that helps. Another one is, could the underlying American forestry canopy data be made available to university community research coalitions? The answer to that is yes. We have a partnership with Google, which provided our national tree canopy, and that's now means that percent canopy data is available for every block group in tree equity score through our data downloads page. So feel free to pop over there and grab that data.
Kelly, this might be good for you. There's a question on if there's analysis available on wet bulb temperatures versus shade. In particular, how trees might be a good means of mitigating the worst of humidity and temperature.
Yes, that is an active area that scholars are working on right now. And so you can, this is not something we addressed in this particular study, but you can definitely look that up and see what they're finding. The studies that I'm aware of are finding that shade is good in humid and in arid environments.
I see a question from Ted about the shade cast by trees, which I think could offer a little bit more nuance to is, does your shade cast by trees consider the vertical geometry of the height? And I think what we're getting at is, does the shade continue underneath the tree? And we can confirm yes. So the difference between how the buildings are treated in the data set and trees and other is that anything that's not a building, shade can flow underneath. So that would include, shade sails, for example, as well. So hopefully that helps to, I think that answers that question. Let me know if it does not, but you'll see, especially in the Phoenix story, you can see some animations of the raw shade data, and you can see where the tree canopy and shade cells have shade that flows underneath, especially at noon when the sun is highest.
I see a question, a very important question. What are the action steps I can take to make an impact on increasing shade equity in my community? Well, hopefully this can be a tool to help you make the case that shade is important and identify where it needs to go. So, auditing shade is certainly a first step. And then thinking about all the rules and the regulations that might be preventing shade from going into the places where it's needed. It's one thing to kind of geographically pinpoint where it might be needed, but it's also important to understand who uses a space for what reason, at what time of day, and why. So you might say, oh, well, here's a space that is being highly used at 3 p.m. and there's not a lot of shade. Right? This can help you with that kind of messaging. But then ultimately, it's just keeping this conversation going, getting the awareness up, and being really targeted about the interventions and the policy vehicles that you go forward with. Oh, and talking to communities. Maybe they don't want shade in a particular place. Maybe they can help you pinpoint where it is needed most, right? So. Oh, the data is not open source, correct, Julia?
The block group data is available publicly, but the raw data underneath would be a request, and that would be to UCLA.
The minimum standard area you'd start to classify shade deserts. That's a great question. I think that the minimum area would be the boundary of the space that's being used. I know that's like a really flexible target, because you could talk about a neighborhood being a shade desert, but within a neighborhood, even if there's low shade, there could be kind of high-low pockets. But if you look at a particular site, like you could think about a commercial area in your city, or you could think about a park area, something like that. If there's not enough shade at the time of day that people are using it, then it would be a shade desert. But that could even be one of our stories, our Detroit story, for instance, looking at bus stops, the immediate areas around the bus stops. Those could also be shade deserts. Yeah, another question about tree species. No, we did not differentiate between tree species in this particular study. Especially in rural areas. Yeah, again, that's not something that this study addresses, but yes, rural areas have particular challenges, and this is one of the reasons actually why we think tree studies are important and shade studies are important, because a lot of heat planning gets done under the auspices of the urban heat island, and that's a relative metric. And it says one thing, but a lot of rural areas are hot on absolute terms, not relative terms, because they don't have all that built up infrastructure. So this kind of data can be really helpful in saying, look, absolute terms, it gets really hot in our community and we don't have enough shade. So we're actually working right now, Lana and I are working in the Eastern Coachella Valley with a rural community that in California that does not have very much shade, and we're helping them to create a shade plan. Okay, next question. Someone lived in Houston, hot and humid for a decade. Yeah, you definitely did experience extreme heat. Question for Lana and I about the LA data set. Will you be showcasing maps this summer? Oh, at the UCLA IOS, that's a specific conference. I don't know. We would be happy to if we are invited. We do work pretty closely with LARC and the LA Climate Emergency Mobilization Office, and we would be happy to collaborate with them to get this data into the right hands.
I think we've hit all of them that are currently open in the chat, so feel free to continue submitting or raise your hand if you have any others.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, as we mentioned before, all our contact information is currently on the screen. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. And otherwise, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate your participation. And if you do end up using this data, please let us know. We'd love to see the different use cases across different fields and whatever you're interested in. Please keep us updated.